It was the sound that woke me. Not the shrill insistence of the telephone, nor the knock of a messenger, but a single bell, faint, deliberate, and resonant in the wet Oxford morning. It came from somewhere beyond St. Giles, from one of those chapels whose towers I could no longer distinguish by name or virtue. The air was cold, almost metallic. I remember wondering, absurdly, who had died this time. I had been sitting by the window, half listening to the wireless and half contemplating the crossword. The clue had read, "Toll for an absent friend," 5 letters. I had written "Nell" before the bell itself gave the word a ghostly affirmation. When one spends a life listening for meanings, the world occasionally conspires to answer in kind. Lewis arrived an hour later, coat dripping, his hair flat with rain. He had that look of restrained concern that I always found more irritating than touching. "There's been a death at St. Swithin's, sir. Natural causes, they think." He hesitated, waiting for the inevitable question, which I did not ask. Instead, I poured myself a small whiskey and watched the amber circle dissolve into the glass. The call had come from the porter's lodge. A visiting lecturer, Dr. Julian Hartley, found dead in his rooms early that morning. A heart attack, apparently. I asked who had made that judgment. "The porter," Lewis said. His tone carried the weight of shared futility. In Oxford, death was often misfiled under decorum before anyone bothered to check the index. When I finally walked through the college gate, the rain had turned to mist, and the stones of the quad glistened like oiled parchment. The place smelled of damp wool and candle smoke. A student cycled past, oblivious to mortality, the bell of her bicycle chiming a lighter echo of the one that had summoned me here. Hartley's staircase was narrow, worn by centuries of unrecorded footsteps. His rooms were book-lined, of course. Every Oxford corpse is surrounded by footnotes. The window stood open despite the chill, and the curtains swayed like hesitant witnesses. On the table lay a manuscript, Latin if I recall correctly, alongside a half-finished letter. The ink had bled slightly, as though it too had been caught unawares by the rain. Lewis spoke softly behind me. "The doctor says his heart simply stopped." I nodded, though my eyes lingered on a wineglass beside the bed. There were 2. One rim bore a faint trace of lipstick, the kind that resists washing away. It told me more than the doctor could. Hartley, the eternal bachelor scholar, had not been alone on the night before All Hallows Eve. I leaned closer to the letter. The salutation was blurred, but one word at the bottom stood clear. "Forgive." That was all. Forgive whom or for what, I couldn't say. Yet forgiveness rarely enters a scholar's vocabulary unless guilt has already set up residence. Outside, a bell began again. This time measured, official, the college announcing its loss to the city. I found myself counting the strokes and wondering why the first chime had sounded earlier before anyone could have known. Some ritual, perhaps, or some conscience ringing ahead of time. On my way out, the porter stopped me to hand over a folded newspaper, its edges curled with damp. He said Hartley had been reading it the night before. I glanced at the headline without much interest, until a smaller notice caught my eye. Annual Halloween Lecture, Dr. Julian Hartley to speak on Masks of Penance. Beneath it, in the same column, an advertisement for a local bookshop announced a rare auction of medieval manuscripts. Coincidence, the lazy mind would say. But Oxford, in my experience, arranges its coincidences with theatrical precision. Lewis asked if we should open an inquiry. I told him we already had. A man dies before his lecture on masks. A letter ends with forgiveness. A bell rings twice, once too soon. Somewhere between those events lies a reason, faint but insistent as that first toll of the morning. That night, back in my flat, I poured another measure and filled in the rest of the crossword. The last clue, end of all sounds, 4 letters. I wrote bell again. Perhaps I was wrong the first time. Perhaps the answer had never changed. The city outside lay silent, its towers unseen in fog, and still, in the distance, the echo lingered, calm, resigned, and somehow already familiar. It is remarkable, looking back, how the dead retain their air of dignity when found among the relics of their own scholarship. Dr. Julian Hartley lay on his back upon a narrow bed, as though resting after a long and rather pointless tutorial. His spectacles had slipped to one side, giving him a look of mild surprise or perhaps amusement. A man caught in the act of realizing something too late. There was a newspaper folded on his chest, its print damp where his hand had pressed against it. I remember the date. October 29th. 2 days before All Hallows. Lewis waited by the door, careful not to step on anything. He had the decency of a man who still thought of death as a private matter, not a professional inconvenience. I told him to open the curtains. The light fell across the books. Scores of them, arranged with pedantic neatness. Most were on medieval verse, a few on theology, and one, rather oddly, on human physiology. It was open on the desk at a chapter titled Cardiac Failure. Hartley had bookmarked the page with an envelope. The porter, when I asked, said Hartley had returned late the previous night after a fellow's dinner. He had been cheerful, he claimed, even humming. It was a small observation, but I found it difficult to imagine Hartley humming. He had been, by all accounts, the sort of man who preferred quoting to singing. Still, the porter swore to it, and I let it rest there, though the note lingered like a wrong key struck on an old piano. On the mantelpiece, a framed photograph drew my eye. 4 figures stood beside the gates of St. Swithin's. Hartley, a younger woman I did not recognize, a cleric, and a tall man whose smile seemed almost forced. Someone had taken the trouble to crop the picture unevenly, slicing away a 5th figure. The cut was careful, almost reverent. I found that detail oddly moving and quietly accusatory. Lewis, ever dutiful, read from his notebook. The doctor says natural causes. I asked which doctor. He replied, the college physician. I asked if the man had seen the body before death. He hadn't. The diagnosis, then, was convenience dressed as certainty. I left it at that for now. There was a faint smell of candle wax near the window. Someone had burned something, perhaps a letter, perhaps something less literal. The ashes in the grate were fine, white and recent. One corner of unburnt paper clung to the edge. I could just make out a line of Latin before it crumbled at my touch. Peccatum sub persona celatur. Sin hides beneath the mask. I knew enough of Hartley's lectures to recognize his own hand. Lewis asked if we should search for notes. I told him to look for the things most men leave behind unwillingly, not what they intend to be found. He frowned, then checked the wastebasket. Beneath a page of proofs and a torn wine-stained napkin lay a small receipt from a local bookshop. The name written in a hurried scrawl was Eleanor Marks. I had heard it before, though not in academic circles. She ran a shop near the covered market, a haven for the obsessive and the lonely, which includes most scholars of my acquaintance. We left the college as the chapel bell began again, low and sonorous, marking the hour of compline. Students hurried past with scarves and satchels, oblivious to the small tragedy behind the closed oak doors. The air smelled of rain and laurel leaves. Lewis asked if I believed it was murder. I told him belief was the wrong word. The dead do not require our belief, only our attention. That evening, I read the newspaper Hartley had clutched. In the margin of one column, an advertisement for the Halloween lecture, he had underlined a single phrase, masks and mercy. It meant nothing at the time, or perhaps it meant too much. Either way, I could not sleep. The bell from St. Swithin's tolled again at midnight, as if rehearsing the sound it would make 2 days hence for him, and for reasons I could not name, I counted the strokes until silence returned. I've always believed that a man's work, when examined too closely, tells us less about his genius than about his concealments. Hartley's study had yielded one such concealment, a sheaf of papers bound with a fraying red ribbon, the Latin text neat and deliberate, the marginalia hurried and self-absorbed. It was a translation, or so it first appeared, a fragment from the 14th century, all penitence and allegory. Yet there was something modern in its unease, something almost autobiographical. Lewis, reading over my shoulder, asked what it meant. I told him that meaning was rarely in the words themselves, but in the errors a man allows to remain. He took that as sarcasm. I meant it as confession. The poem, or sermon perhaps, told of a pilgrim who wore a mask of virtue to hide his wound. Nothing remarkable in that. Oxford was built on the same principle, but in Hartley's careful script, one line had been translated twice. The first version read, "For guilt shall be covered by silence." The second, faintly erased, offered, "For guilt shall be covered by love." The change was not theological, it was emotional. Men alter their translations when the heart interferes. I took the pages to the college library, where the silence had a weight all its own. Dust hung motionless in the narrow beams of light. The librarian, Miss Dawson, regarded me with that patient suspicion reserved for policemen in academic precincts. She said the manuscript had been brought to Oxford by Claire Fenwick, the young English tutor. A prodigy, she called her, though the word sounded more like a warning. Hartley had been helping her prepare a critical edition for publication. That partnership, it seemed, had not been without friction. In the library register, I noticed the manuscript had been signed out 3 times in the last fortnight, first by Claire, then by Hartley, and finally, and this was curious, by Reverend Alderton, the theologian who had dismissed the work as nonsense. I asked Miss Dawson whether Alderton had shown much interest in medieval Latin. She said he had shown interest only in propriety. I made a note of that, though in my experience the most upright men are the most expertly balanced over a secret. As I left, I paused before a display of rare books. Someone had pinned a small card beside a volume of sermons. Masks of Penance. Lecture, October 31st. The title echoed the advertisement Hartley had underlined in his newspaper. I wondered if the manuscript had inspired his lecture, or if the lecture had given him an excuse to steal from it. Back at the station, Lewis had found little else of consequence, except for one thing. Among Hartley's effects, a page of notes bore the initials E.M. at the bottom. Eleanor Marks again. He thought it trivial. I did not. A man rarely keeps another's initials unless they still matter. I tried to piece the fragments together, a medieval poem about concealment, a scholar dead before his lecture on masks, a woman whose name survived only in initials and ink. Somewhere between text and translation, a motive was waiting to be read. That night, unable to sleep, I returned to the Latin. The pilgrim's mask, it said, was lifted not by truth, but by accident. The word Casu appeared twice, though in one instance the U had been smudged to resemble an AA. Casa, house, a slip, or perhaps a clue. Hartley's handwriting had always been precise. I took it as deliberate, a private signal to himself or to someone else, pointing to a place rather than a cause. Outside, rain murmured against the glass, and somewhere a church clock stumbled through its chimes. I thought again of the bell that had rung too soon on the morning of his death. The manuscript remained open on my desk, the red ribbon like a thin line of blood across the parchment. It occurred to me then that every translation hides an original wound. and that Hartley, in revising his lines, might have been trying not to reveal the truth, but to atone for it. There are faces one remembers not for what they reveal, but for what they seem to withhold, the faint suggestion that their silence is deliberate. The woman I met that afternoon at the bookshop had one such face. Eleanor Marks. The name felt as though it belonged on a dedication page rather than a doorstep. She stood behind the counter among the smell of old bindings and dust, her hair drawn back severely, the rest of her softened by shadow. Lewis had found her through a receipt left in Hartley's study, and though he regarded it as routine, I had already imagined the conversation before it began. A polite denial, a trace of bitterness, perhaps a glance too long at the name of the dead man. She did not disappoint. She told us she hadn't seen Julian Hartley in months. She said it in the manner of someone who had once loved him and had trained herself to speak his name as fact, not memory. There was something faintly theatrical about her composure, the sort that comes from grief reheated over time. Behind her, a clock ticked too loudly for the smallness of the room, marking pauses she did not intend to fill. I noticed a ring on her right hand, a plain band of silver worn down at one edge, the kind that leaves a faint indentation when removed. I doubted it had belonged to her. She caught my glance and folded her hands beneath the counter. Her gesture was small, almost tender, but it confirmed what the ring had already told me. That affection, once claimed, had been retracted but not replaced. Lewis, dutifully, asked about the manuscript. She smiled without warmth. "It was mine," she said, or at least the translation was. Hartley had borrowed it for his lecture. A simple favor, she called it, though her tone suggested the kind of favor that becomes intolerable once pride has curdled. She went to a shelf and returned with a thin folio, its cover stained faintly with wine. When she handed it to me, the scent of candle wax lingered. I asked whether she had been to St. Swithin's recently. Her eyes did not flinch, but her voice wavered just enough to betray her. "Once," she said, "2 nights before he died. To return a book. Nothing more." The porter's memory of a woman in black came back to me then, and I looked again at her coat. Not black exactly, but an inky blue that the lamplight deepened into morning. She must have known what the color would suggest. Some people crave invisibility. Others dress to be mistaken for ghosts. We left. Her there, among the rows of forgotten poets, and as we stepped into the drizzle, Lewis remarked that she seemed genuine enough. I told him genuineness was an overrated virtue. People rarely lie with their words. They lie with the order in which they choose to tell the truth. That evening, I read her manuscript. Her Latin was elegant, unforced, with the kind of fluency born from both intellect and intimacy. In the margin beside one verse, "The mask of mercy is heavier than the mask of guilt," she had written a small note in pencil. "J's revision weakens the tone," a professional remark, perhaps. But the possessive J said more. When I turned to the last page, I found an unfamiliar hand, Hartley's, correcting her translation, softening her sharpness, replacing her word condemned with forgiven. The ink was fresher than the rest. A scholar's correction, yes, but also a plea. I poured a drink and stared at the page. Outside, a car passed along the cobbles, its headlights flashing briefly across my walls like an intrusion of conscience. In that moment, I understood why Eleanor had worn black. Not for mourning, but for irony. She was not grieving the man's death. She was grieving his repentance. The next morning, the bell at St. Swithin's tolled again, the same low voice across the city. It sounded like memory correcting itself. An echo repeating the word it had once misheard. There is an unmistakable air that settles over Oxford during its formal dinners. The perfume of tradition mixed with quiet deceit. At St. Swithin's, the air was heavier still that evening, perfumed faintly with candle wax and burgundy. the kind that turns reflective men into liars and liars into poets. I had been invited, reluctantly, as a gesture of collegial respect, though I suspect curiosity played its part. The fellows, like ravens around a carcass, wished to see how a policeman might dine among them. The halls shimmered with candlelight reflected off silverware and dark oak. Faces half lit, half veiled. Each guest appeared to wear some subtle disguise, a mannered civility concealing motives as varied as their academic gowns. At the high table, Claire Fenwick sat poised beside Reverend Alderton, her laughter too precise to be spontaneous. Opposite her, the bursar drank with missionary zeal, and somewhere in between floated the absence of Julian Hartley, that most articulate of ghosts. Lewis, seated uncomfortably 2 places away, whispered later that the food had been splendid. I remembered none of it. My attention wandered instead to the college's coat of arms above the dais, a mask and torch intertwined, and wondered if Hartley had chosen his lecture title to mock them or to confess through them. When the dessert arrived, a silence spread with the deliberation of ritual. A senior fellow stood to recite a poem. Hartley's translation, I was told, from the very manuscript I had been studying. The words fell neatly, from his lips, perfectly measured, and yet something jarred. The line that should have read, "Mercy unmasks the sinner," had become, "Mercy conceals the sin." A subtle reversal, perhaps deliberate, perhaps not. I saw Claire's hand tighten around her wine-glass. The candlelight caught the trembling of the liquid inside, a small, private storm. The toasts followed, perfunctory and hollow. Hartley's name was mentioned only once, in the past tense, as though it were already too late to speak it honestly. Across the table, Eleanor Marks watched in silence. Her black dress absorbed the light. Her expression absorbed everything else. When our eyes met, she smiled faintly, a gesture that could have meant anything. Condolence, triumph, or the cruel amusement of someone who has already read the last page. During the port, Alderton leaned toward me with a sanctimonious gravity. "A tragedy," he murmured. And yet perhaps a necessary one. He was not referring to divine necessity. Men of his cloth rarely are. I asked what he meant, but he deflected, spoke instead of repentance of the lecture Hartley had planned to give, of how mercy requires silence more than confession. His eyes, pale and watchful, held mine too long. I wondered whether the verse had been changed for poetic effect or moral justification. Lewis, meanwhile, had struck up a conversation with the college secretary, who mentioned an oddity. Hartley's final wine order had been delivered that same morning, though the bottle was never found. I made a note of it, but said nothing. Murder, in my experience, often begins with a simple act of hospitality. When the final toast was raised, the fellows donned small paper masks, a childish tradition dating back to some medieval revel. Each face became an echo of Hartley's lecture title, each smile a hollow imitation. I declined mine. To wear a mask seemed redundant. After the hall emptied, I lingered by the table where Claire had sat. Her napkin bore the faintest trace of ink, not from a pen, but from a fingertip that had brushed across it, stained perhaps from correcting proofs. It was smudged in a single curved line, a parenthesis enclosing nothing. Outside, the wind moved along the cloisters, carrying fragments of laughter from the quad. The night smelled faintly of apples and rain. I thought of that altered verse, the mercy that conceals rather than unmasks, and knew it was not an accident. Somewhere in the rewriting of that line lay the rewriting of a life, and someone at that table had known it. It was Lewis who found it, though I imagine he will never claim the credit. We had returned to Hartley's rooms that grey morning, more out of habit than expectation, and the place looked smaller than before, as if death, having taken its leave, had folded the air in on itself. The curtains hung limp, the bed already stripped by college servants, the faint smell of old paper and rain persisting like a ghost that refused dismissal. Lewis was checking drawers for bills, lecture notes, anything that might flatter the term evidence. He had the tact not to disturb the books, but his instinct, that dogged, unromantic instinct of his, made him tug open the smallest drawer in Hartley's desk. It was stiff, as though unused. Inside lay a single envelope, pale cream, unsealed, the paper slightly warped by moisture. He handed it to me without comment. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, the long, slanted loops of someone educated in patience and elegance. It read simply, Julian on the front. Inside, one sheet only. The ink had blurred in places, as if written in haste or through tears. I have forgotten many things in my life, but not those first lines. You said once that words conceal more than silence. Perhaps that is why I must write rather than speak. What remains between us cannot be forgiven, only understood. Before the 31st, you must act, or I shall have to. No signature, though there was perfume, faint and unplaceable. Not the heavy sweetness of Eleanor Marks. Something lighter, sharper, almost nervous. I read the note twice before realizing that the lower edge bore the imprint of another sheet once pressed against it. Lewis fetched a pencil, and with the care of a man sketching his own confession, I shaded lightly across the paper. The indentation emerged like a photograph in its bath. 2 letters, C.F. Clare Fenwick. It should have been simple enough. A quarrel between collaborators, an argument inflamed by pride or betrayal. Yet the phrasing troubled me. Before the 31st, you must act. That suggested not anger, but desperation. And in Oxford, desperation is the mother of discretion, not violence. Still, I folded the letter carefully and slid it into my pocket. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping against the window panes like an impatient clock. Lewis asked whether it changed anything. I told him everything changes something, even a misplaced comma. He muttered that it sounded like one of my crosswords. Perhaps it was. I spent the afternoon walking through the quads, thinking about the letter, the mask, and the odd symmetry of words and wounds. Clare's lectures, I recalled, often quoted medieval penitentials. The notion that confession itself could be an act of vanity. Hartley, by contrast, had preached redemption through language, as though writing were a form of prayer. Between them, perhaps, there had been a collision not of bodies, but of beliefs. When I finally saw Clare again, in the corridor outside the college library, she greeted me with a composure that felt studied. She said she had heard from Lewis that I had reopened the case. I told her I preferred the term reconsidered. Her eyes flickered at the word, and for a moment I caught in them the exhaustion of someone rehearsing innocence. I asked, casually, whether she ever corresponded with Hartley. She smiled, thinly. She said that all communication between scholars was correspondence of a kind, that words once exchanged had their own half-life. Then she turned away, her hands clasped tightly enough for the knuckles to whiten. I could almost hear the echo of her letter in that gesture. Before the 31st, you must act. That night I sat alone with the note spread before me and a crossword beside it. One clue read, unspoken admission, 5 letters. I wrote guilt, though something in me doubted the accuracy. Hartley had been a man of letters in every sense. It seemed somehow poetic, if cruel, that his final communication should also be his undoing, and that it was not his words, but their silence between the lines, that condemned him. There is something indecent about touching the possessions of the dead, a trespass disguised as inquiry. Yet in Oxford we have built an entire profession upon it. When the archivist at St. Swithin's called to say that one of Hartley's diary pages had gone missing, I knew it would not be the result of carelessness. Scholars misplace truth, not paper. The diary itself was an austere little book, bound in maroon leather, its spine worn smooth from repetition. The entries were brief, clinical, often just a phrase. Met CF after chapel. Lecture postponed. Letter sent. A man writing for his conscience rather than his memory. Only one page, the archivist said, had been neatly cut out. The one dated the night before his death. Lewis examined the torn edge, his brow furrowed in that way which suggested practicality battling superstition. He said it looked like a razor blade. I nodded. Scholars prefer precision when erasing things. I asked who had last handled the diary. Reverend Alderton, it turned out, had borrowed it under the pretext of preparing a memorial sermon. I wondered how many of his congregants had died just to give him material. When we visited Alderton in his rooms, the air smelled of pipe smoke and disuse. Books leaned drunkenly in their shelves. Sermon drafts lay scattered like unconfessed sins. He received us with an expression of weary piety. He said he had looked at the diary only to glean a quotation for his sermon. Something uplifting about masks and redemption. His tone was so measured it felt rehearsed. I noticed a fragment of thin paper caught beneath the leg of his writing table. It was blank on one side, but faint ink lines bled through from the other. A few words in Hartley's tidy script. I read them upside down. Alderton insists. No choice left before the 31st. It was enough to silence any doubt that the missing page had been cut by accident. When I held it out, Alderton's eyes flickered toward the hearth, where the ashes were still warm. He said that Hartley had been troubled. Yes, anxious about his lecture, his reputation, his faith. He had sought counsel. Nothing more. I told him that counsel and coercion often share the same vocabulary. He did not reply. As we left, Lewis remarked that he seemed genuinely shaken. I said that guilt is a fine actor, but rarely consistent. Alderton had referred to Hartley's torment, a word not used in the surviving pages of the diary. He could only have known it from the missing one. That evening, back in my flat, I stared at the salvaged fragment under the lamplight. No choice left before the 31st. The phrasing echoed Claire Fenwick's letter. 2 people urging him to act before Halloween. It was no longer clear which of them had wanted salvation and which had wanted silence. I poured a measure of whiskey and opened my crossword. The clue read, cut from the record. 6 letters. I filled in X size. It seemed apt, the page, the confession, perhaps even the life itself, all excised neatly, leaving the surface unblemished and the meaning incomplete. Outside, rain gathered against the window in small, uneven strokes. I thought again of Alderton's trembling hand as he reached for his pipe and of the faint, singed smell that clung to his sleeve. Whatever had been written on that missing page had frightened him. Not because it implicated him directly, but because it revealed a truth that faith could not forgive. I remember thinking then that every act of destruction is also a form of preservation. The missing page had not vanished. It had merely changed its medium, becoming smoke, memory, and suspicion. And as the night deepened around me, I found myself reading its absence more clearly than its words could ever have allowed. I have often thought that truth in Oxford reveals itself not through words, but through accidents. A misplaced paper, a slip of the tongue, or a photograph forgotten in a drawer. This one came to me by way of Lewis, who arrived one rain-blurred morning with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has found something solid. He had been sorting through a collection of college photographs kept in the porter's lodge, the kind that parade the same faces, decade after decade, rearranged slightly but never changed. He laid it on my desk without ceremony. A Halloween supper, 10 years past. A long oak table in the refectory, strewn with masks and goblets, the candlelight frozen in amber tones. Hartley was there, younger but unmistakable. that air of scholarly fatigue mistaken for gravitas. To his left sat Claire Fenwick, looking away from the camera, as though distracted by a sound just beyond the frame. And behind them, in the half-shadow, a friar's habit. The cowl drawn low, concealing everything but a sliver of mouth curved in what might have been amusement or contempt. There were others, of course. Eleanor Marks, in black lace, and Reverend Alderton, already greying, his hands clasped in what I can only describe as devout discomfort. Yet it was the friar who held my gaze. On his robe, barely visible, were embroidered 2 Latin words, peccata teguntur, sins are covered. The same phrase that had survived, half-burnt, in Hartley's fireplace. Coincidence, if one believed in such things. I never have. Lewis thought it a curiosity, nothing more. But something in the composition unsettled me. Everyone else's eyes were directed toward the camera, everyone's except Claire's. Her gaze was angled toward Hartley's glass, a small, accidental motion captured forever. That, I thought, was the real moment. The camera, in its indifference, had caught what memory had tried to erase. Later that afternoon, I took the photograph to the college archivist, a woman whose precision could have put an undertaker to shame. She confirmed the date and the occasion, the annual All Hallows dinner, an evening of mockery and masks. She smiled when I asked about the costumes. Tradition, she said. Each fellow chose a guise drawn from the college's medieval past. The friar's robe, she recalled, had been borrowed from the chapel vestry, later reported missing. I asked who had worn it. She hesitated. Records of attendance had been incomplete that year. That night I placed the photograph on my desk beside the letter and the manuscript. Together they seemed to form a conversation, though each spoke in a different tongue. The letter pleaded for action, the manuscript for atonement, the photograph for memory. Somewhere in the silence between them lay the answer. I stared at Hartley's face again. His expression, that faint private smile, belonged not to a man enjoying a dinner, but to one indulging in irony, as though he already understood the cruel symmetry of it all, that the sins covered by masks would one day be revealed by an image meant for commemoration. Before turning in, I solved a small crossword from the evening paper. The clue read, "Old image revealing truth, 10 letters." I wrote photograph almost absently. Only later, glass in hand, did I notice the coincidence and feel that unease of recognizing something too late. The rain thickened outside, muting the city. From somewhere distant, the college bell struck the quarter hour, that same stubborn rhythm that had haunted the case from the start. I turned the photograph over and found, written in faint pencil, the initials E.M. followed by a single phrase, "For remembrance." I sat for a long while, staring at those words. Whether they were hers or Hartley's, I could not say. But I understood, with a clarity that chilled rather than enlightened, that remembrance is rarely an act of affection. More often, it is a quiet punishment. It was the kind of evening Oxford reserves for its penitent. Rain whispering along the cobbles, the lamps bowed like monks, the air thick with the scent of wet stone and thyme. I had gone to evensong at St. Swithin's not from faith but from instinct. There are moments when a case breathes too loudly, and one must listen to it in silence. The chapel was sparsely filled, the choir uncertain, the sermon brief. Yet when Reverend Alderton stepped up to the pulpit, something in his voice caught against the stillness, a fracture, like a man reciting not scripture, but memory. He spoke of remorse, of sin wearing a scholar's mask, of the danger of confession mistimed. The words circled the air uneasily, and when they broke, he did not finish the final benediction. His hands trembled. The Bible fell shut with a soft, exhausted sound. I saw the faces in the pew stiffen, their discomfort polite and absolute. I waited until the crowd dispersed, then followed him down the narrow stair to the vestry. He did not look surprised to see me. He said that conscience, when it finally speaks, rarely chooses its audience. His room was spare, devotional, yet on the desk lay a bottle of port and 2 glasses, the remains of a ritual not entirely ecclesiastical. He poured for both of us, though neither drank. He said he had known Hartley since their days as undergraduates, that brilliance had always come to the man with a streak of vanity too fine to detect. Hartley, he said, had been planning something. A public repentance, a speech that would have ruined more than one reputation. The lecture on Halloween was to be a confession, disguised as scholarship. I asked what there was to confess. Alderton hesitated, then spoke as though quoting from some other man's script. There had been a student, years ago, a woman of unusual intelligence and misplaced devotion. Hartley had encouraged her affections, borrowed her work, then dismissed her with the finality only intellect can achieve. The poem in the manuscript, Peccata Teguntur, had been hers originally. He had translated not from Latin, but from guilt. I asked whether the student was Eleanor Marks. His silence was assent enough. He said he had advised discretion. The church, he reminded me, understood the mercy of concealment, but Hartley had insisted. He wanted his absolution to be witnessed. There are few things more intolerable to the righteous than another man's remorse. So Alderton had visited him that night, tried to dissuade him. They argued. He left before midnight. Hartley was alive then, he said, and the port unopened. I asked how he knew. He said because it was meant for reconciliation. A small, defeated smile touched his lips. There was sincerity in his tone, or the semblance of it. I believed that he had not killed Hartley, though belief in Oxford is always provisional. What lingered was fear, not for his soul, but for his position. He had helped bury the truth once and now feared being unearthed with it. When I left him, the chapel was dark, but for one candle still burning near the altar. The wax had pooled into a small red lake, its edges brittle as though time itself had hardened there. I thought of Hartley, of Claire Fenwick's letter, of Eleanor's smile behind the bookshop counter, and of how each had been writing, speaking, translating the same sentence in different tongues. Forgiveness mistaken for erasure. At home, I unfolded the service sheet from my pocket. On the back, in Alderton's faint pencil, a fragment of the sermon remained. Not all confessions seek redemption. Some only desire to be heard before silence resumes. I poured the port he had given me, drank it alone, and considered how easily a confession can sound like an alibi. And how often, in this city, they are the same thing. There are moments in an investigation when one no longer pursues the truth, but is pursued by it. A slow, deliberate turning of tables. That evening, I felt precisely that. The manuscript had returned to my desk, its ribbon loosened as if by exhaustion. 2 versions of the same Latin verse lay before me, each in a different hand. Hartley's first, Eleanor's original, and beneath both, a faint, almost invisible correction made later, Claire Fenwick's. A triangle of scholarship, pride, and deceit, inked in 3 shades of guilt. Lewis had gone home hours before. Outside, the rain had deepened into something more persistent, a rehearsal for winter. The room smelled of tobacco and paper, the scent of thinking too long. I poured a drink, and in the yellow glow of the lamp, I began to read aloud the passage that had haunted the case from the beginning. The penitent hides his sin beneath the mask of mercy. The true wound is unseen, but it speaks through the silence of the tongue. Hartley's translation was close, but his Latin had been tampered with. One small verb, celatur, had been altered to sanatur. Hidden becomes healed. The difference, as I knew too well, was not linguistic but moral. Hartley had softened the truth, or perhaps Claire had done it for him. I found her the next morning in her rooms, standing by the open window with a manuscript spread out on the table like a confession. She asked if I had come to accuse her. I said that would require certainty, and I rarely had the luxury. Her gaze flicked to the window, where the chapel bell was striking 9. She said that Hartley had promised to protect her, to publish her translation under both their names. He had broken that promise, as men like him always did. The confession, she said, had not been meant for the world. It had been meant for her. She told me she had gone to him that night with wine. To make peace, she claimed. He had poured 2 glasses. He was tired, she said, distracted. She had left before midnight. When she returned the next morning, he was dead. She looked at me then, steady, almost serene, as though reciting a passage already memorized. On her desk lay the second translation, her own handwriting, the same verse rephrased, "The wound conceals itself by healing." I asked her why she had written it again. She said that forgiveness was a kind of deceit, and that perhaps language was too. As she spoke, I noticed a small ink stain on her thumb, the same dark blot that had marked the margin of Hartley's notes. It was a trivial thing, yet it tied her more surely to him than any confession could. The mark of collaboration or complicity. I did not arrest her. Perhaps I should have. Instead, I took the manuscript and left her there, standing in the quiet, a figure framed by rain and remorse. Some crimes are too carefully written to be rewritten by law. Back in my flat, I turned again to the crossword. The clue that night read, "Change of meaning, 11 letters." I filled in translation. It seemed almost too obvious, but then truth often is, when one has exhausted every other possibility. I placed Claire's version beside Hartley's, letting my eyes blur the words together. Hidden, healed, 2 faces of the same sin. Somewhere between them lay the motive, the method, perhaps even the mercy. Outside, the rain eased into silence. The bell of St. Swithin's struck the hour again, clear and final. I thought of Hartley's last revision, the pen faltering between concealment and confession, and wondered, not for the first time, whether the act of translation is merely another way of asking to be forgiven. There is a peculiar stillness that precedes the act of accusation, a moment when the air itself seems to withdraw, as though unwilling to bear witness. It was under such a hush that Lewis and I crossed the quad that afternoon, our steps dampened by fallen leaves, the faint smell of rain and port lingering together like some misplaced memory of comfort. Claire Fenwick had not fled. Flight, I suspect, would have seemed to her a vulgar admission. Her rooms were open, the window unlatched to let in the late October chill. She was seated at her desk, a cup of tea cooling beside her, the manuscript spread before her like an altar cloth. She looked neither surprised nor afraid, only weary. That peculiar Oxford weariness that comes from realizing intellect cannot out-argue conscience. I told her what she already knew, that Hartley had died not by divine intervention, but by human hand, that the morphine found in his bloodstream had been delivered through the glass of port she had poured him, that she had meant only to silence him for the night, perhaps, not forever. She did not deny it. She said quietly that Hartley had taught her everything about deceit, except how to live with it. Lewis stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the quad below, as if to grant us the privacy of an ending. The bell from St. Swithin's struck 4. Its sound filled the pause between us with something both solemn and merciful. She asked, almost idly, whether confession might count as atonement. I told her it counted as memory, which is sometimes the same thing. I remember the way she gathered her hair before fastening the clasp of her coat, that small, careful gesture of composure. There was dignity in it, and a kind of pity, though I could not say for whom. As we walked her across the quad, the students parted with that unthinking curiosity reserved for the newly fallen. At the gate, she stopped. The air was crisp with wood smoke and the faint sweetness of decay. She said that she had always loved the sound of the bell here, how it seemed to absolve even those who hadn't asked for it. Then, after a long pause, she added that mercy and guilt were perhaps only two sides of the same translation. I might have smiled if it hadn't hurt to. Lewis drove her to the station in silence. I followed on foot, slower, the city dimming around me. Oxford has a way of absorbing tragedy without ceremony. It files it away beside the dissertations and memorial plaques, waiting for another to rhyme with it. Back in my flat, I poured a drink and unfolded the final page of the manuscript. The verse, her verse now, stared up at me in its new form. The wound conceals itself by healing. I thought of her phrase, her soft correction to Hartley's cruelty, and wondered whether that was her defense or her epitaph. Later, the telephone rang. It was Lewis, his voice unsteady in its usual politeness. She had confessed formally, he said, without hesitation. She had asked that her statement include a line from the poem. He couldn't recall which. Something about mercy. I told him I remembered it well. After he hung up, I sat in the quiet and finished the crossword. The final clue read, "End of deception, 6 letters." I hesitated, then wrote, "arrest." It seemed too literal, too final, and yet as I looked at the word, I realized that was precisely what it meant. To stop, to still, to fix in place what had been moving too long. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped behind the college spires. The bell sounded once more. Slow, unhurried, almost forgiving. I raised my glass toward the sound, not in triumph but in recognition. Oxford, I thought, keeps its ghosts well fed. It is the sound I remember most, that slow, measured tolling of the bell across the city, dissolving through mist like a heartbeat that had finally accepted its rhythm. Oxford, in its way, had resumed its equilibrium. The newspapers, ever practical, called it a scholarly tragedy. The college issued a statement of sympathy and restraint. Even Lewis, bless him, found something almost comforting in the neatness of it all. But I have never trusted neatness. It is only the most delicate disguise disorder can wear. I went back to St. Swithin's one last time, the morning after Claire's confession. The quad was empty save for a gardener sweeping wet leaves into small compliant piles. A sparrow hopped along the edge of a puddle, its reflection trembling with every chime of the bell. The chapel doors were open. I stood for a moment in the nave, listening to the faint echo of yesterday's sermon. Or perhaps I only imagined it. Alderton was nowhere to be seen. I think the man had learned that the church is ill-suited to the sound of its own conscience. On the lectern, someone had left a service sheet folded into quarters. A line from one of the hymns caught my eye. "Forgive us our translations, though they alter the word." It seemed an odd choice for the day after a scholar's death, or perhaps too apt to be coincidence. I slipped it into my pocket. Some souvenirs resist sentimentality by disguising themselves as evidence. Lewis met me by the gate, his breath pale in the cold air. He said Claire had been calm during the drive to Reading Jail, more curious than remorseful. She had asked if Hartley's papers would be preserved. He told her they would. She had smiled at that, as though posterity were a mercy large enough to absolve anyone. I asked if she had said anything else. Only that Oxford had its own version of justice, he said. I didn't ask what she meant. We walked together to the river. The trees were bare now, their reflections stretched thin in the slow current. I told him I had been thinking about Hartley's final correction, that single verb change from hidden to healed. Lewis said it made no difference. The man was dead. I told him perhaps it made all the difference. Some people spend their lives altering one word, trying to make the world more bearable. Hartley had simply chosen the wrong language. Later, back in my flat, I found myself staring again at the photograph from the Halloween supper. The faces blurred now, as though the paper itself had grown tired of keeping their secrets. I poured a drink and thought about the symmetry of it all. The letter, the manuscript, the confession, each echoing the same rhythm of concealment and exposure. In the end, the case had solved itself through exhaustion, as they all do. Truth, I've come to think, is less a revelation than a surrender. Outside, the city darkened into its usual poetry of lamps and drizzle. Somewhere beyond, the bell began again, slower this time, each note lingering just a little too long before fading. I counted them without meaning to. 10, 11, 12. The hour of endings disguised as continuance. I stood by the window, the glass misting with my breath, and thought of Claire's voice in that quiet room. Her calm acceptance, her terrible composure. She had said that mercy and guilt were only two sides of the same translation. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps every sin is just a word, misread too late to be corrected. When the bell ceased, the silence that followed seemed almost grateful. I finished my whiskey, turned off the light, and let the city recede into its patient anonymity. Somewhere, a page turned in the wind, and I fancied it might have been Hartley's diary, or the manuscript, still rewriting itself beneath the hand of time. Oxford, I thought, would keep it safe. Oxford always does.